The fog rolled in from the Atlantic like it had a mind of its own, curling through the streets of Millfield, Maine, drifting past shuttered houses and abandoned piers, heavy enough to hide secrets, light enough to let them slip through the cracks. It was the kind of fog that belonged in postcards of haunted towns, but Millfield didn't need postcards every corner. Every alley had a story, whispered and half forgotten. I stood in my garage, wrench in hand, the familiar weight of it, a kind of comfort. The rust-coloured Honda Civic groaned under my inspection, oil dripping in stubborn beads onto the concrete floor. It was the same Civic I'd been fixing for Mrs. Patterson for 3 years running. Same leak. Same excuse about money being tight. "Ethan, you listening?" Paul's voice cut through the quiet hum of the garage. My best friend leaned against the workbench, one hand gripping a cold beer despite it being barely noon. He was a fixture at Murphy's Bar, reading people the way most people read menus, instinctively, unflinchingly. 15 years of tending bar had honed him into a kind of human lie detector, but he mostly used it for entertainment. "Your wife's back in town?" I asked without looking up. "Yeah," Paul said, taking a slow sip and raising an eyebrow. "Good for her." I wiped my hands on the rag hanging from my belt and shrugged. There was no excitement in me about Lana's return from Miami, no relief, no warmth. I'd spent the last 4 days carefully avoiding thoughts of her trip, her absence, her silence. She'd called it a girls' trip, a break with her best friend Megan, living it up in South Beach while I stayed behind in Millfield, running the garage and pretending not to care. Pretending I hadn't noticed she blocked my number. Pretending I hadn't noticed the small gaps in the life we'd built together. That was a lie. I'd heard plenty, just not from Lana. Funny thing about blocking someone's phone number, it doesn't block everything, especially when you share an iPad and your wife forgets to log out of her iCloud account. Especially when photos sync automatically. Especially when you, for reasons you can't entirely justify, decide to look. The images were harmless at first. Megan and Lana laughing in a pool, sunglasses reflecting the sun in a Miami hotel. But then there was him, the third man. Standing close to Lana, arms around her in photos that were supposed to be casual, smiles that looked easy, natural, but not the kind of natural I remembered from our old photographs. There was tension there. And I felt it across the miles, the gulf of ocean and secret keeping that separated us. Paul took another swig of beer, watching me frown at the Civic. "You're staring at that car like it owes you money," he said, "or like it's hiding something." "It might be," I muttered, tightening a bolt that refused to cooperate. "Or maybe it's just stubborn. Or maybe it's a lot like your life right now." Paul tilted his head, studying me. Messy, leaking everywhere, and full of things you'd rather not look at. I ignored him, focusing on the Civic. Cars were simpler than people. Metal didn't lie. Oil stains didn't hide secrets, they revealed them slowly, stubbornly, until you had no choice but to see. The garage smelled of motor oil and old leather, with a hint of rust and the faint perfume of the sea drifting in through the cracked window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, trying to peer inside. I could hear it in the occasional squawk of a gull or the distant lapping of waves against the pier. Millfield was quiet, but the fog brought life to its corners. Shadows moved that weren't there in the sunlight. Whispers lingered in doorways. I knew them all, and yet I didn't. Paul leaned closer, voice dropping. "You been snooping?" I looked up. His gaze wasn't accusatory, just knowing. The way someone sees a man standing on the edge of a cliff and waits to see if he'll jump. "Maybe a little," I admitted. "Not everything." Paul whistled softly. "Not everything, huh? You mean you haven't figured out how to talk to your wife without it ending in a fight?" I shook my head. "Not yet. You're walking a tightrope, Ethan, and you're blindfolded." He had a way of saying things that cut through the fog in my head. He didn't give advice. He handed truths wrapped in sarcasm and a beer-soaked grin. But this time, it stuck. Tightrope. Blindfolded. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had no idea what I was doing. I put the wrench down and rubbed my face, trying to push the images of Lana and the man out of my mind. But even as I did, I couldn't. Faces lingered in photographs, and memories, unlike cars, didn't let you tighten a bolt and make them work again. The Civic hissed under my inspection, oil pooling at its feet. I leaned against the hood, thinking about the subtle angles of Lana's smile, the way she'd always carried herself with ease and confidence. And now, those same angles were in photos with someone else, someone I didn't recognize. Paul clapped me on the shoulder. You're thinking too hard, man. Cars, beer, fog. That's what you've got. Don't overthink people. They're messier than that, Civic. Trust me. I wanted to believe him, but the nagging doubt wouldn't leave. I remembered the text she'd sent before leaving. Girls' trip. Don't worry. Those words were meant to reassure, to distract, to keep me calm while she was doing whatever she was doing. But I knew better. I went back to the Civic, tightening another bolt, forcing myself to focus. But the fog outside pressed harder now, curling around the garage like it knew I was trying to ignore something. And maybe it did. Maybe the fog had a mind of its own, carrying secrets in its cold, damp fingers. I heard the garage door creak. A shadow fell across the concrete floor. I looked up. Paul was still leaning there, watching, and I realized he wasn't judging. He was waiting to see what I'd do next. The images haunted me, yes. But it wasn't just the photos. It was the silence, the blocks, the distance. The feeling that someone I'd trusted had crossed into a world I couldn't see, and now I had a choice. Look away or follow the trail. The Civic dripped another bead of oil onto the concrete. Slow, persistent, unforgiving. I knew I couldn't ignore it. The morning fog hadn't lifted. It hung over Millfield like a shroud, curling around the lampposts and telephone wires, wrapping the town in a silence that wasn't quiet, it was watchful. Even the gulls seemed muted today, their cries swallowed somewhere between the sea and the sky. I sat at the edge of the garage bench, the iPad in my hands, scrolling through images I shouldn't have seen. Every swipe brought another stab of guilt and curiosity, two emotions I couldn't separate. Lana, Megan, and him. The man was there in nearly every photo from the trip. At brunch, leaning casually against Lana's chair, smiling with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. By the pool, closer than a friend should be, the sun glinting off his sunglasses, a hand brushing against hers. And in one picture, a dimly lit nightclub, he had his arm draped around her shoulder as if she belonged there. Not in Millfield, not with me, but there. I tried to stop. Really, I did. I put the iPad down on the greasy workbench, let my eyes wander to the Civic again, tried to focus on tightening the stubborn bolts, but the images lingered in the corner of my mind. Shadows of sunlit pools, late-night streets of Miami, laughter that didn't include me. Paul noticed. He always notices. Still staring at it? He asked, sipping his beer. Not staring, I muttered. Reviewing evidence. He raised an eyebrow. Evidence of what? That your wife went on vacation and didn't tell you she took pictures with a guy you don't know? I didn't answer. Instead, I unlocked the iPad again and dove back into the cloud. There were text messages too. I hadn't planned to look at them, but curiosity is a tricky thing. It pushes and pulls at you like a tide you can't escape. Messages between Lana and Megan were casual at first, shopping plans, brunch reservations, but soon the tone shifted. Mentions of the man, fleeting at first, grew more personal. Jokes, teasing, references to moments I wasn't part of. And then there were deleted messages, still partially recoverable, that hinted at late-night meetings, unexplained absences, whispers of excitement, danger, maybe both. I felt a lump in my throat. My hands shook slightly, though I tried to steady them as I scrolled. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a gnawing dread. Something about the way he was in the photos. It wasn't just that he was close. It was that Lana seemed different, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in years, laughing without hesitation, free. I glanced at Paul. Do you ever think people can just change? He shrugged. People do what they want. You just hope it doesn't involve breaking the stuff you care about. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth was pressing against me like the fog outside. I didn't know my wife anymore. Not really. Not if she could smile like that with someone I didn't recognize. I spent the day obsessing over details most would consider trivial. The angle of a photograph, a hand gesture, the pattern of light on someone's shirt. The Civic sat idle, oil dripping in tiny, stubborn beads onto the concrete. A quiet reminder that some things never change, no matter how much you want them to. Cars leak. People lie. Maybe it was that simple. By late afternoon, I decided to see if I could identify him. Social media offered clues, though nothing concrete. A tagged location, a mutual friend of Megan's from college, a shadowed profile picture. Piece by piece, I began to reconstruct who he was, or at least, who he appeared to be. His name wasn't familiar, but he had connections. Friends who liked the same beach bars, the same hotels, the same nightlife. And that made him dangerous, in a sense. Not violent, not criminal. Dangerous because he represented a world I couldn't access. A world that had pulled Lana away from me without warning. Paul leaned against the doorway, watching me with a mix of concern and amusement. "You're getting obsessed, man. You know that, right? You're staring at pictures of a vacation you weren't invited to, like it's going to tell you a secret worth knowing." I didn't look up. Maybe it will. Maybe it'll ruin you first. The sun dipped lower, and the fog began to thicken, swallowing the edges of the garage in a grey haze. Shadows pulled in corners, and the familiar squeak of the Civic's hood felt like a clock ticking down a warning I wasn't ready to hear. I had a choice. Stop. Pretend I hadn't seen anything, trust Lana, and let her come back to me. Or dig deeper. I chose the latter. Night fell. I left the garage, walking the streets of Millfield, fog curling around my ankles, soft and cold. The town seemed asleep, but I knew better. Secrets don't sleep. They linger in alleyways, in the smell of old paper and salt water, in the flicker of street lamps against cracked pavement. I passed Murphy's bar, empty except for Paul, who waved me in. I shook my head. Not yet. Instead, I wandered to the pier, staring at the dark Atlantic stretching endlessly before me. Miami felt impossibly far away, but the fog made it seem close, like a phantom wave waiting to wash me away. I could almost feel her there, laughing, unaware of the consequences of her actions, unaware of the hole she left behind in Millfield, in my life. And then I saw him, not in person yet, but in a photograph projected in my mind. The man from the trip, the one who didn't belong, the one whose presence had transformed Lana into someone I barely recognized. My hand clenched into fists. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to confront him. But there was something else fear. The fear that, in uncovering him, I'd uncover more than just infidelity. I'd uncover the cracks in my own life. The cracks I'd spent years ignoring. By the time I returned to the garage, night had fully claimed Millfield. The Civic waited, patient, oil dripping steadily onto the floor. Paul was there, cleaning a beer mug, looking up at me with the same quiet, steady gaze. "You going to tell me what you found?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not yet, but I will," he sighed. "Just don't lose yourself in it, Ethan. You're better than that. Or at least, you were." I forced a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. Maybe I still am, but the fog outside pressed harder now, curling into the garage, carrying with it the unspoken truth. Secrets, once found, cannot be ignored, and mine were just beginning to surface. I stayed up all night, scrolling, cross-referencing, connecting dots that didn't want to be connected. Every photo, every text, every shadow in an image whispered a question I couldn't answer. Who was he? Why was he there? And most importantly, why wasn't she with me? The Civic's oil stains spread slowly across the concrete, persistent, indifferent. I felt a kinship with them. Slow, stubborn, impossible to ignore. By morning, I knew I couldn't stop. Millfield was small enough that strangers didn't go unnoticed. Everyone knew everyone, or at least, they thought they did. And yet, there he was, somewhere in the photos, somewhere in the whispers of my mind, someone who didn't belong. I spent the morning in the garage, the Civic half disassembled, bolts scattered across the bench. Each turn of the wrench felt mechanical, almost meditative, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The man's face kept creeping back into focus, dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes that seemed to smile at something only he understood. I didn't know his name, I didn't know his story, and yet the presence he had in Lana's life now felt like a violation of my own. Paul arrived mid-morning, beer in hand, leaning against the doorway as if the garage were a stage and I the tortured protagonist. "You still staring at that iPad?" he asked, a grin playing on his lips. "Or are you going full detective mode now?" "Detective mode," I muttered, "doesn't feel like enough." "Careful, man. You start digging, you don't know what you'll find." I knew that. But the need to know overpowered every shred of caution. I had to find him. The internet offered fragments, social media profiles, tagged photos, hotel check-ins. Nothing concrete, but enough to build a skeleton. He was connected, had friends who frequented Miami's nightlife, and seemed to enjoy the thrill of presence photos always showing him at the center, confident, untouchable. Every detail painted a picture of someone deliberate, someone aware of the power his charm held over people like Lana. I scrolled through the images repeatedly, memorizing angles, patterns of light, gestures. In one photo, he held a cocktail, his wristwatch glinting, while Lana laughed beside him. Something about the way he positioned himself like a shadow at the edges of her life felt predatory, or at least invasive. I went for a drive around town in the Civic, fog pressing in against the windshield, the headlights slicing thin lines through the grey. I imagined him here, in Millfield, blending into the quiet streets, pretending to belong. I imagined Lana smiling at him over coffee at Murphy's, waving at me as if nothing had changed. The thought made my stomach tighten. Back at the garage, I pinned photos, notes, and screenshots across the wall. A map of Miami's hotspots, a timeline of messages, a web connecting Lana, Megan, and the stranger. Each piece seemed harmless alone, but together, they formed a picture I couldn't ignore. Paul watched silently for a long moment before breaking the tension. "You're obsessed," he said softly. "And not just a little. This thing is consuming you." I met his gaze. "I can't stop. Not yet." By evening, I had something tangible, a partial name, a familiar face if you squinted, a shadow of his identity. I traced it down the way a detective might, piecing together fragments from social media and public records. Each lead was tenuous, but it was enough to suggest he wasn't just a random tourist. He had purpose. He had design. The fog thickened as night fell, curling into the garage through the open door. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating the Civic and my scattered notes into grotesque shapes. Paul left early, muttering something about early shifts at Murphy's, leaving me alone with the images, alone with the creeping dread that had settled like a weight across my chest. I took a walk into town, letting the fog swallow the familiar streets. The air smelled of salt, oil, and damp wood. I imagined the stranger here, slipping unnoticed past the lampposts, past the shuttered shops, blending into the ordinary. My mind raced, connecting dots, imagining confrontations that hadn't happened yet. At the pier, I paused, staring at the Atlantic stretching into darkness. Waves licked the shoreline quietly, deceptively calm, and I realized something. I wasn't just searching for him to protect Lana. I was searching to understand her, to understand what had changed, to understand why someone else had become part of our story. I returned to the garage, tracing the stranger's patterns on paper, writing notes in a spiral notebook. Every day, the fog pressed harder. Every day, my obsession grew. And I knew, deep down, that finding him, or trying to, might change everything. Not just for Lana, not just for me, but for the fragile life we had built together. The Civic's oil puddled slowly on the floor, drip by drip, persistent, indifferent, like time itself. And I understood something chilling. Some strangers aren't just in photos. Some strangers invade life. The morning fog had lifted slightly, revealing Millfield in muted greys and washed-out blues. But the calm was deceptive. Inside the garage, I felt the weight of the stranger pressing down on me like a lead coat, thick and unyielding. Every photo, every message, every fleeting glance I'd memorized haunted me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not Lana, not him, not the gap that had opened between us. I heard the front door creak before she spoke. "Ethan?" Her voice was cautious, measured, tentative, like stepping on ice. I didn't look up. My hands were greasy from the Civic, my mind tangled with images of Miami nights and the stranger's easy smile. "You're back," I said, my voice flat, careful. She stepped closer, hesitation written in her posture. "I told you I'd be back. I didn't expect you to be like this." "Like what?" I asked, finally setting the wrench down. I faced her, seeing her fully in the garage light. Lana had always carried herself with grace, but now there was a defensiveness in her eyes. A warning. A question. She swallowed. "Like you've been looking." The words hit me like a wave I hadn't seen coming. "Yes," I admitted. "I saw the photos." Her expression tightened. "You went through my iCloud?" "Yes," I said again, and there was no pride in it, only truth. I needed to know. She laughed softly, though it was bitter. Needed to know, or needed to punish me? I shook my head. Not punish. Understand. She took a step closer. eyes searching mine. Do you understand now? I nodded slowly. I think so, but it doesn't make it easier. We stood there in silence, the Civic between us, oil glistening on the floor like dark little mirrors reflecting our fractured world. I wanted to ask questions, but the words tangled in my throat. Finally, I found one. Who is he? Her gaze fell. It's complicated. I clenched my fists, trying to steady the storm in my chest. Complicated is fine. I can handle complicated. Lies and secrets, I can't. She sighed, the tension in her shoulders melting slightly. His name is Adrian. I met him at a conference in Miami before the trip. It was just a connection, nothing serious. Nothing serious? I repeated. Lana, he's in every photo. He's there in messages. He's there when I'm not. I know, she whispered. And I didn't want you to find out this way. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I looked at her, searching for any trace of the woman I'd loved, the one I thought I knew. Do you even know what that means? The trust between us? I know, she said again, softer this time. And I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. I didn't want to hurt you. I felt a pang, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and lingering love. Why him? Why Miami? Why not tell me? She met my gaze fully now, eyes shining with unshed tears. Because I needed space, because I was confused, because I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself, what I was feeling. The garage felt smaller, air thick with unspoken words. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make her understand the hurt. Instead, I breathed deeply. You can't just hide from your life, Lana, I said quietly. You can't just slip into another world and expect me to stay still. I know, she said, voice breaking. I know. For a long moment, we just stood there. The Civic between us, oil pooling slowly on the floor. Time seemed to stretch, the fog outside curling closer as if it had come back to witness our confrontation. Finally, I spoke again. I need to know the truth. Everything. Not just about him, about you, about us. I can't keep living in half-truths. She nodded, tears spilling now. Okay, I'll tell you everything. And she did. She told me about her doubts, the loneliness she'd felt while I was buried in the garage, fixing cars, living routine. She told me about Adrian, how he had been a temporary distraction, a mirror reflecting the parts of herself she'd ignored, how she hadn't planned for it to go this far, how Miami had been both escape and revelation. I listened. Anger bubbled up, sharp and bitter, but beneath it, a faint understanding began to take root. I saw her vulnerability, her confusion, and for the first time in days, I felt the possibility of connection not unbroken, not easy, but real. Paul's words echoed in my mind. You start digging, you don't know what you'll find. He hadn't been wrong, but he hadn't known I'd find truth as well as betrayal. When she finished, I sat down on the bench, exhausted. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said honestly. Not yet. I don't expect you to, she replied. I just wanted you to know. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in days, the fog outside didn't feel suffocating. It was still there, yes, curling into corners and hiding shadows, but inside, something had shifted. Something fragile, like the first crack of sunlight through grey clouds. You need to leave, I said finally. For now, think about what you want, about us. She nodded, understanding. I will. She left the garage, leaving me alone with the Civic and the fading scent of her perfume. I ran my hands over the hood, feeling the cold metal, the oil stains, the weight of everything we'd just uncovered. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if we could rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time, I knew what needed to be faced. The stranger was part of our story now, and ignoring him or the truth he had forced into our lives was impossible. The fog pressed against the garage again, but this time, it felt different. Less like a threat, more like a witness. We had confronted the lies, we had faced the tension, and while the night was still long and the road ahead uncertain, there was clarity in the confrontation. I sat there until the last light faded, the Civic resting silently, oil dripping like a metronome, every drop marked time, marking change. And I realized something. Confrontations don't always solve everything, but they force the truth into the open, and sometimes that's enough. The fog that had clung to Millfield for days was finally beginning to thin, curling back toward the Atlantic like it had exhausted its grip. The town looked different now, softer, muted, almost gentle. But for me, nothing had changed, not completely. The garage smelled the same, of oil and metal and damp wood, but there was an edge in the air, a tension that lingered despite the clarity outside. I walked among the scattered tools, boots scraping against the concrete. The Civic waited patiently in the center, oil stains marking the passage of time. I ran a hand along the hood, tracing the grooves and scratches, each one a reminder of years spent fixing what could be fixed. Cars were simple, parts either worked or they didn't. People were not so straightforward. I thought about Lana. She'd been gone most of the night, taking a walk along the pier, I imagined, or maybe just sitting in the quiet of the hotel room she had checked into. I didn't know. And in truth, part of me didn't want to know, at least, not fully. The confrontation from the day before had left wounds that were raw but honest. For the first time, I had her truth. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Paul arrived mid-morning, exactly when he knew he would, and leaned against the doorway with a smirk. "Look at you," he said, arms crossed, "sitting among your little pieces of misery like some noir detective. You're glowing." "Not glowing," I muttered. "Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" he asked, taking a long sip from the beer he'd brought. "The woman who walked away, the stranger, the iCloud, the Civic, all of it?" "All of it," I admitted. Paul chuckled softly. "Well, congratulations, you've officially lost the plot. But maybe that's okay. Maybe life isn't about keeping the plot straight, it's about surviving the twists." I let his words hang in the garage, feeling the strange comfort of them. He was right, of course. Life wasn't neat. It was messy, full of mistakes and secrets and moments you couldn't control. But confronting the mess, facing the truth, had given me something no one else could. Perspective. Later that day, Lana returned. The moment she stepped into the garage, the air seemed heavier. She carried herself cautiously, almost afraid, but her eyes held something I hadn't seen in days, a tentative hope. "I've thought a lot," she said softly, standing near the doorway. "About us, about what I've done. I want to try to make it right." I nodded slowly. "I want that too. But it won't be easy, not after what's happened." She took a hesitant step closer. "I know. I'm willing to try. If you are." I studied her face. I saw the guilt, the fear, the longing, and I realized that love, real love, wasn't about perfection. It was about facing the chaos together, acknowledging the mistakes, and deciding whether the bond was strong enough to endure. We didn't speak much after that, just stood in the garage, listening to the faint drip of oil onto the concrete. Each drop sounded louder than it should, marking the passage of time, the rhythm of our tentative reconciliation. In the days that followed, life in Millfield began to settle into a new routine. I worked on the Civic, and the townspeople went about their lives as usual. The fog no longer pressed in against the streets, leaving the town bathed in muted sunlight, but beneath the calm, things had shifted. Trust had been tested, boundaries had been redrawn, and the stranger, the man from Miami, was now a shadow in our past, a reminder of choices made and consequences faced. Paul stopped by one evening, leaning against the bench with his usual grin. "So, what now?" he asked. "Civic fixed? Marriage patched up? Or are we still waiting for the next twist?" I smiled faintly, wiping grease from my hands. "The Civic will hold. The marriage? We'll see. But at least we're moving forward. That's something." Paul nodded, finishing his beer. "Forward is good. Just don't forget, sometimes forward means looking back too." I thought about that as he left, the garage door closing with a soft thud behind him. Forward, yes, but always aware of the lessons learned, the mistakes made, the secrets uncovered. The stranger had left a mark, but he hadn't broken us. Not entirely. Lana came back into the garage later, her presence quiet but steady. She leaned against the bench beside me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a fragile sense of normalcy returning. We didn't speak immediately, just existed in the shared silence, watching the Civic, the tools, the oil stains. "The fog's lifting," I said finally, glancing at the window where sunlight now sliced through the morning haze. She smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's about time." I nodded. "Not just outside, inside too." I think. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of the garage, the distant call of a gull, and the quiet, persistent drip of oil. It was a sound that had haunted me through the storm, a reminder of everything I had faced and survived. Millfield was still the same small town, quiet and watchful, but something fundamental had changed. The fog had lifted, revealing the truth in stark relief. And while the future remained uncertain, I knew one thing. We had endured the shadows, and the light, faint, fragile, but real, was back. The Civic waited, patient as ever, and for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next.